Good evening. I recently bought this book, Life, by Keith Richards. You know, I've reviewed on this channel several autobiographies. I'd love to have you look at some of the old ones I did. I hope I'm getting better at making these videos. The early ones are terrible. I watch them sometimes and I think, oh my God. But I think I'm getting better. But I did the Eric Clapton autobiography. I did the Patty Boyd Harrison Clapton autobiography. Wonderful tonight. I did the Dr. John autobiography. And tonight I'm going to do another great rock autobiography, which is Keith Richards. You know, just a phenomenal figure in 20th century culture, really. You can't say enough about him. And, you know, I kind of wanted to begin this book, talking about this book, just by referencing something that I've always thought is true about Keith Richards. Keith Richards is one of those people that everybody laughs at. He's kind of like that guy everybody kind of likes, but no one takes him seriously. No one would ever put him on the Supreme Court, or he doesn't wear a suit, he doesn't act all serious and use a lot of big words and go on TV and try to be an expert on everything, even though he's an expert on music for sure. And the man is really a very smart, creative, unique, wonderful person that's contributed so much to our world. And but we always kind of laugh at him. You know, this is a really good book. It's well written, I would say. It's kind of slangy in parts, but it's very interesting. One interesting thing I'll say about the book, it's about 550 pages long, and the first 450 pages only take you up to the Studio 54 years. You know, Studio 54 was with, when the Stones were going into Studio 54 with Liza Minnelli. And that's kind of the late 70s, kind of the Saturday Night Live era. And that's most of the book. That's 80% of the book is from when he's a kid to the late 70s. So if you think about it, he kind of blows over the 80s and 90s and the 2000s pretty quickly, but it's a chronicle of those early years, the heyday of the Stones, and which I guess if you think about it, is the period that was when they were in their prime. Now in the 80s and 90s, they played great, but they were kind of playing their old songs a lot and enjoying life and the fruits of their labors. But it was those first 20 years of their existence as a band that really really was the defining part of their career. And Keith Richards is so important. I think I was reading the reviews on Amazon on this book, and a lot of people said it was, Keith Richards talks about drugs all the time, and it's just too bad. Really, I would say there's a lot of that in here, but I think he talks about music a lot. Now, if you want to read a book that's like that, I read this book when I was about 20. And it's called Up and Down with the Rolling Stones. It's by a guy named Tony Sanchez. I used to have a bigger copy. I ordered this over the internet. And Tony Sanchez, he's mentioned, Keith Richards mentions him. He's legitimate, was an inner circle of the Stones. He was there when they recorded Exile on Main Street, Sticky Fingers, hanging around all the time. And this book goes into all the parties. This is like Caligula. I mean, it's just like debauchery. It's just like you can't believe it. So if you want to read that, I would read this. But you'll miss some of the what I would say is the important stuff, which is the beautiful, wonderful music. But anyway, this is a very good book. His early life is really interesting. I've got some notes here. His early life is really interesting. He was born in Dartford in England, which is about 20 miles away from London, in post-war London. It's a lot like reading the Eric Clapton biography. You know, I read the Paul McCartney biography, those early Beatles. They all kind of come out of that. All those British invasion bands came out of post-war London. Keith Richards said when he was a kid, he'd walk over rubble. And even though he was born in 1943, during the war, and he was born in a crossfire hurricane. Supposedly, he was born during an air raid. Said even though he was a little baby and he doesn't remember it, he's still shell-shocked because when he was like 1 and 2, they had these bomb raids going off, and even though he doesn't really remember it, it's affected him somehow. And he said he never really had any candy till he was like 9 or 10 years old because of the war rations that were still going on. It was kind of he had a pretty tough background. That was sort of interesting to me. You know, it's not like reading Paul McCartney. You know, those kids weren't overprotected in those days. In some ways, that's kind of refreshing. They were boys will be boys. So he used to get in a lot of fights on the way home from school. He didn't start them, I don't think, necessarily, but kids would pick on him. And so he would, you know, as he got older, he learned to fight back. He says one time they found a dead body in a field off somewhere where they were playing. So it's pretty colorful boyhood. It's kind of there's a certain Mark Twain element to it. He didn't do too well in school. His friend, he met Mick Jagger early on, but Mick Jagger was actually a better student, so ended up in better schools. Now they hooked up later, but for quite a while when they were like in their early teens, they were going to different schools, and Keith Richards kind of went to the shop class and the I don't want to say the burnout school, but Mick Jagger was a pretty good student. I think Mick Jagger went to the London School of Economics for a while. So these are smart guys. It's a very interesting take on that early post-war period. His grandfather, Gus, was the guy who bought him a guitar, and I think his mom's side had a lot of music in the family. So like so many of these people, there's a musician. I don't know, my grandpa always said music runs in families. So his mom's side, it sounds like they had a lot of music. They would sing a lot around the house. His mom was quite a good piano player, and his grandfather, Gus, was just a very loving, supportive grandpa, and gave him a guitar and taught him like the D chord. He said that was his first chord where he learned to kind of make it, there's nothing that rings on a guitar like a D chord. And he kind of got that D chord ring, and he never really looked back. And so it's really good. He talks about, the famous story where he already knew Mick Jagger, but they hadn't seen each other in a while. And at that time in England, I guess this would probably be the late 50s, records were kind of like baseball cards. They were kind of rare, but everybody wanted them. All these like old blues records, Chuck Berry, Elvis, all the influences you would think, old blues guys. A lot of it was American music, quite interestingly. An interesting thing was some country music. I think that's the people always emphasize rock, American rock, and American blues as influencing British kids like the Beatles, but also country music. Yeah, so all that American music kind of had made its way over to England. But Mick Jagger, they met, and Mick Jagger was carrying a bunch of records, and so they started talking about records. It always kind of reminds me of like when I was a kid, we would have baseball cards. You kind of, do you have a Willie Mays, or do you have like Ernie Banks, and hey, I've got an Al Kaline and a Harmon Killebrew or something, and they're kind of trade off, and it's kind of neat, and they got a lot of records out of the public library. And then they kind of started a band, and they played their first, I guess Brian Jones was kind of the guy who really started the band, and this would be like in the early 60s. And they started playing a little bit. I thought one of the greatest points in here is that there were jazz musicians around. One of the best jazz drummers around was a guy named Charlie Watts, and they wanted Charlie Watts to play in their little kind of, they had kind of a amateur band, and they wanted to get better, and they knew they needed a good drummer. So they just scrimped, stole, and saved to pay Charlie Watts to get him to play with them, because Charlie Watts, you had to pay the guy. He wasn't just going to show up and be kind of this good old Joe amateur hanging out in the garage or something. He wanted to get paid. So there's a lesson there somewhere. They got themselves a good drummer, and they paid him. It wasn't easy either. It sounded like it was hard, but they paid Charlie Watts. And once they got Charlie Watts, and also kind of like that was with Bill Wyman, they got those. That made them a better band, and that enabled them to go start making money. So they weren't penny wise and pound foolish. They were like, we want that Charlie Watts, and if we have to sell our kidneys or something, we're going to get him in the band, and they did it, and they did, but once they got him in the band, and they would have to pay him, but he was so good, he added that element. Keith Richards said, I played enough that it took me a while to realize this, how important a good drummer is. It just sort of, everything comes together when you have a good drummer. And he said once they started playing with Charlie Watts, they just blossomed into this really good blues band, R&B and blues and little rock and roll combo band. And so by 1962, they had a record deal, and that was that would be the early lineup: Brian Jones, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Bill Wyman, and Charlie Watts. At this point, it starts to get like a lot of famous stories. They did a lot of blues at first, kind of covers, but they needed there's a famous story, I think a lot of you have probably heard that, where the record producer was Andrew Oldham, locked Keith Richards and Mick Jagger in a room and said, write your own song. And I'm not opening this door till you have a great song. So they sat in there for a while and wrote As Tears Go By, which is a great song, which became a hit for Marianne Faithfull. And of course, I grew up hearing this, I'm sure most of us grew up hearing actually the Stones version. But and then by then, we were in the mid 60s, in 1964, which I think was the same year the Beatles came to America, the Stones came to America. They did the Ed Sullivan Show. It's kind of the Beatles versus the Stones. They followed a lot of the same path that the Beatles did. and we're just a great band, got popular on both sides of the Atlantic. Um, Another interesting thing, Keith goes through a lot of the Brian Jones stuff. Brian Jones, he said, Brian Jones had a lot of personal problems. He was a good musician, but one of the things Keith says about Brian Jones is that one of the things that really drove a wedge between Brian and the rest of the band was when Mick and Keith started writing all those great songs, and it was probably making more money. I don't know if it was a money thing, but when Mick and Keith are writing all these great songs that are on the radio, and they're songs we've all heard, and those are all Jagger Richards songs. Jagger and Richards, they're up there with Lennon and McCartney. They wrote they were a great songwriting team. And that kind of made Brian Jones, who had actually kind of been the original Stone, really, he kind of felt more and more alienated. And by the end, he was barely on, I guess, Beggar's Banquet, and was he even on Let It Bleed? I think he maybe was on a track or something. And then they got Mick Taylor. But they go through a lot of he goes through a lot of the Brian Jones stuff. And then they got Mick Taylor, which is always my favorite period. He really says a lot of smart, interesting things about music. I jotted some down. He said that he never liked to read music. He doesn't read music. I think the quote is, he feels so fortunate that he's not in the prison of those 5 bars and those bars and those 5 little lines, referring to musical notation. Now, I read music quite well, actually, and I definitely think it's a good thing to be able to read music. But I actually I know a lot of people that read music. They can play anything, but they can't play Happy Birthday without reading music. And music is a language, and I think that's what Keith Richards is saying. Music is a language. It would be like if you could only read and you couldn't talk. And he said he became so fluent on the guitar with the way he played. Some people would say he plays sloppy. He's not trying to do 90-mile-an-hour technical things all the time, but he plays very fluidly and at ease with himself as he plays, which is the mark of a professional player. He's very at ease and relaxed as he plays. But he said it's like a language to him. It just all these riffs come out, and he said every time he plays, all these great riffs comes out, and all the Stones classics are just a small sampling of the riffs he just comes up with all the time whenever he plays. And it's like a gift from God or nature or whatever, just all these creative ideas. And if you think about it, he's got so many classic riffs, and they feel good. It's not like he's trying to be out really technically, he's not sort of contriving something. It's just they feel so good to everybody. He said if he could only play one riff, it would be Jumpin' Jack Flash. That's the best. He thinks that's the best riff he ever wrote, and it is a pretty damn good talks about how they kind of developed this thing they call guitar weaving. I think that was especially when they got Mick Taylor, but even with the Brian Jones stuff, where they get, there's no one person like playing like I'll play the rhythm, you play the lead. It was just they both were kind of rhythmish, leadish players, and you just have all these kind of lines weaving in and out. And I think that's really something you notice on a lot of the great Stones songs, like in the late '60s and early '70s. But that's a signature element of the Stones sound. The Stones have never been, a band with big, heavy, dramatic lead guitar solos. They have leads. Mick Taylor actually played a lot of leads that were really good. If you watch like some of the Mick Taylor, like Get Your Ya-Ya's Out or Ladies and Gentlemen, the Rolling Stones, you'll hear a lot of Mick Taylor playing leads. But I think overall the Stones are more known for just these guitars that never really stop moving, but they're never really out there, with an out and out lead. Or they have leads, but that kind of just interplay of the guitars all the time is kind of what makes their music so great. He talks about when he picked up open tuning, and that really was in the late '60s, around '68 or '69. And if you think about it, that's right around the time Brian Jones was getting ready to leave the band and then ultimately die. But that was around the time that he picked up open tuning, and that really changed the Stones sound. And if you think about it, a lot of those signature Stones songs are from the late '60s and early '70s. That's like that's the great period of classic rock, like from '68 to maybe '74, '75. I've always thought there's great music before that, there's great music after that, but that's that kind of encapsulated by Woodstock, and but that's the period. And that's when the Stones did those 4 really good albums: Boom Boom Boom, Becker's Banquet, Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, and Exile on Main Street. Before that, they had His Satanic Majesty's Request. And after Exile on Main Street, they did Goat's Head Soup. I used to listen to that album a lot. It's a good album, but that's kind of taking you more into the mid-'70s. And a lot of, it's not cited as often, but those 4 albums kind of produced a lot of the Stones classics. And one of the things that really made their sound so definitive on those records was him playing in those open tunings, especially open G. Just awesome. Awesome stuff. But this is a very good book. I really recommend it. I think it has a lot of detail. Like there's a lot of detail in there. It talks about Ian Stewart, who was the so-called Sixth Stone, and what a good piano player and good guy was. And then the record company didn't really want Ian Stewart in the band per se. I think he didn't really look the part. He was kind of a big, beefy guy, and he wasn't this skinny kind of rock and roll looking guy. And he was kind of looked like a big football player or something. But he never really quit the band. He was always kind of in the band. He plays on all their records, and he was on stage with them half the time. So as kind of a side man, and he drove their car. They talk a lot about Ian Stewart. He talks, there are a lot of the parties. This book has the index factor. It's got a good index. If you saw my Patty Boyd autobiography, you saw that you can go a lot by the index. You see all kinds of famous names, and so it has a lot of that kind of extra detail that he would remember. But to me, the best parts of the book, they weren't all the crazy parties. I think some people were expecting that. There's a lot of sort of the narrative of his life, which is very interesting and does kind of, I think, give the best and fullest picture of this important life of 20th century music. But he really offers a lot of insight into music and his thoughts about music. And I think that's one of the great things. And I guess I'll just conclude with that, like I said at the beginning, people make their Keith Richards jokes. I used to play I played for a little while with some guys, and one of the guys, he was a good enough guy, I know, but he was a classic. You always hear about, like, he was like a lawyer he had like a $5,000 Gibson Les Paul and some boutique amp, and he owned the PA, and we practiced at his house, which was like a mansion. The only problem was he wasn't really a very good. He had that kind of robot arm, you know. He was never really going to be a good player, but he was one of these doctor lawyer types. And he said that one time he said, "That Keith Richards is such a waste. He's such a loser." And I was kind of polite. I didn't say anything. But when I got in my car and drove home, I had this rant in my mind. It's really, you think Keith Richards is a loser, huh? You think he's a waste case? You think Keith Richards is a waste case? And I kind of wish I would have done that. I would have liked to have handed him a Telecaster and said, "Listen, bud, here's a Telecaster. You play tumbling dice and make it sound that awesome, that wonderful, that good, you know. It just makes people so happy, and more than that, you write it." And you couldn't, you know. You got a $5,000 Les Paul there, and you wear a suit to work every day, and you could never come up with anything that's an infinitesimal fraction of that awesome, you know. And I basically kind of wanted to call him an asshole. I'm glad I didn't. But you know, Keith Richards is a smart man. He's and the Stones are just such a good band. But he is a brilliant man, and he's lived his own life. He's lived his own life. He took the road less taken, and you know, he's worked hard. Don't you know? I think everyone thinks about these parties. He always says everyone Exile on Main Street. People think that's such kind of a hedonistic album. They worked all into the wee hours and all the hours and hours, day after day on those albums. You know, those are labors of love, and they're really well put together albums. Those aren't a bunch of goof off. You know, there are kind of bands that were kind of in that hedonistic lifestyle that have these kind of sloppy jam albums, you know, but the Stones albums are all great. You know, they have that kind of sloppy quality in the sense that they're not contrived and sort of artificially perfect. They're you can tell there's like guys playing that just are having a good time, but they're really great players, and they spend time putting together really good songs. And but this guy said to me, "Keith Richards is a waste case. He's a loser." And I drove home. I said, "You think Keith Richards is a waste case with your $5,000 Les Paul and your, you know, you have no clue, you know, and your robot arm, you know, it will never ever play a nice smooth rhythm, you know." But this is a good book. I really recommend it. It's got some good pictures in it. I'll show you the pictures, but you get a lot of the shots. They're usually pictures, even in the more famous ones, the color photos. You know, there tend to be ones you haven't seen maybe, but the ones that I think are interesting are the ones of when he was a kid and early. Well, God bless you. Keith Richards' Life. And that's an interesting title, isn't it? Life. Just, is it his thoughts on life? Is it his life? Is it a treatise on life? Maybe all of the above. God bless you. And Keith Richards is not a clown. He's not a waste case. He's a very smart man, a very creative man. And in order to be as creative as he was, you know, he's lived his own life. And he's been very successful at that. And he's a towering figure as far as I'm concerned. Just an awesome artist. He's kind of fun. You have to admit. He's kind of fun. But when you take away the fun, he's a great artist. And this is a good book. I think you should read it. Thank you. God bless you.